Greetings! This is Darkmaster491 and today I'm showcasing my Weakness Policy Greedent in some Series 8 ranked double battles. Here's the team that I'll be using along with the rental code so you can try out this team for yourself. I made timestamps for this video as usual, so if you want to skip ahead to the battles you can click on any of the timestamps which you can find in the description for this video. I'm going to briefly explain how this team works and then we'll jump into the battles. And after the battles, I'll give a full team analysis for this team which will include an explanation about the EV spreads and attacks for my Pokemon, and the strategies that you can use with this team. The main strategy of this team is to have Stakataka use Body Press onto Greedent to prop Greedent's Weakness Policy so that Greedent can deal big damage with its attacks. But Greedent and Stakataka are very slow Pokemon, so first I'll need to have my Stakataka set up the Trick Room so that my Greedent and my Stakataka can move before the opposing Pokemon on the following turn. My Stakataka is slower than my Greedent, so my Stakataka will move before my Greedent under Trick Room and it can use Body Press to prop my Greedent's Weakness Policy, and then my Greedent will be at +2 attack thanks to its Weakness Policy. I also have some other options on this team if I'm not able to set up the Trick Room. My Calyrex Shadow Rider can use the move Speed Swap to swap its speed stat with my slower Pokemon to make them really fast. Indeedee is there for Follow Me and Helping Hand support, and finally I have Torkoal and Venusaur. Torkoal does great under Trick Room, and my Venusaur has the Chlorophyll ability which doubles its speed when the sun weather is in effect. And Torkoal is the perfect partner for Venusaur since Torkoal sets up the sun with its Drought ability. Anyways, I'll talk more about my team after the battles, so let's get to the first battle now. Alright, so here's the first battle. My opponent is going to lead with Whimsicott and Dracovish, while I'm going to lead with my Greedent and my Stakataka. My opponent probably doesn't expect my Stakataka to have the Focus Sash item, so I'm going to predict that my opponent will go for the Helping Hand and Vicious Rend play to try to knock out my Stakataka in one hit. The Whimsicott could have went for a taunt to stop my Stakataka from setting up the Trick Room, but it makes more sense for the Dracovish to try to knock out my Stakataka with a Vicious Rend. And my Stakataka is going to survive on 1 HP thanks to its Focus Sash item. I'm going to make a really aggressive play and have my Greedent set up a Swords Dance while my Stakataka sits at the Trick Room. So now my Greedent is at +2 attack, and I've got another surprise for my opponent. My Greedent has the Weakness Policy item, and you know what that means. It's time to prop that Weakness Policy and sweep my opponent's team. So now I'm going to Dynamax my Greedent, so it will become a gigantic squirrel that will bring doom to all of its opponents. Mwahahaha! My Stakataka is slower than my Greedent, so it'll be able to move before my Greedent gets to attack. And this is perfect since I can have my Stakataka use Body Press onto my Greedent to prop my Greedent's Weakness Policy, and then my Greedent will get another +2 boost to its attack, which will bring it up to +4 attack. And now my Greedent is going to annihilate this Dracovish with the Max Strike at +4 attack. The reason that I have my Greedent set up the Swords Dance on the first turn is because I need my Greedent to be at +4 attack so that a Max Strike is a guaranteed KO onto Dynamax Kyogre, since my opponent has a Kyogre in the back. The Whimsicott is going to finish off my Stakataka with a Dazzling Gleam, but that's fine since that means my Torkoal gets to come in for free. And my opponent is going to send in Grimmsnarl, so I'm thinking that the Grimmsnarl is either going to set up a Reflect or a Trick a Lagging Tail onto my Greedent. But I have a +4 attack boosted Greedent and a Choice Specs Torkoal that's about to use Eruption, so there's not much my opponent can do with a Grimmsnarl and a Whimsicott under Trick Room. The Whimsicott is going to use Helping Hand, so the Grimmsnarl actually went for an attack, like maybe a foul play or something. So my opponent was hoping that I would ignore the Grimmsnarl, but nope, my Greedent is going to knock out this Grimmsnarl before it gets to attack. They thought they could beat me with a Dark type Pokemon, but I'm the Dark Master, so they're not going to beat me with a Grimmsnarl. And now my Torkoal is going to roast this Whimsicott with a full power Choice Specs Eruption in the sun. So now my opponent is going to send in their last Pokemon, which is Kyogre. I have 2 more turns of Trick Room, so my Greedent should be able to easily knock out this Kyogre with a Max Strike, since my Greedent is at +4 attack. I'm going to switch out my Torkoal and send in my Calyrex Shadow Rider in case my opponent decides to go for a double Protect to stall out the last 2 turns of Trick Room. If my opponent stalls out the Trick Room, my Calyrex Shadow Rider can use Speed Swap onto my Greedent so that my Greedent will get my Calyrex Shadow Rider speed stat, and then it'll become a really fast Greedent. My opponent is going to Dynamax the Kyogre, and they could go for a double Max Guard to stall the last 2 turns of Trick Room, but I'm already 1 step ahead of my opponent and I'm fully prepared for that possibility. Also, I still have my Torkoal in the back, which can switch in to change the weather back to the sun weather, so there's not much my opponent can do at this point. Anyways, my opponent doesn't go for the max guard, so my Greedent is going to knock out the Dynamax Kyogre with a max strike at +4 attack, and that's going to be the game. As they say, slow and steady wins the race, especially after you set up the Trick Room. And this battle showcases exactly how destructive Greedent can be under Trick Room. Alright, so here's the next battle. My opponent is going to lead with Whimsicott and Reshiram, while I'm going to lead with my Greedent and my Stakataka. I'm going to make the same play as I made in the previous battle, which is to have my Greedent use Swords Dance, while my Stakataka sets up the Trick Room. My opponent is going to Dynamax the Reshiram right away, so they're going all in on this turn to try to deny the Trick Room. But I'm pretty sure that my opponent won't expect my Stakataka to have a Focus Sash, so my opponent will probably go for the Helping Hand and Max Quake play, or have Whimsicott use some other support move while the Dynamax Reshiram goes for the Max Quake into my Stakataka. The Whimsicott goes for a Helping Hand, so I'm guaranteed to get my Trick Room set up since my opponent cannot knock out my Stakataka in one hit, since my Stakataka has the Focus Sash item. And the Reshiram goes for the Max Quake into my Stakataka as I expected, but my opponent wasn't expecting my Stakataka to have the Focus Sash item. The Reshiram and Whimsicott will get a special defense boost from the Max Quake, but that doesn't matter at all since both of my Pokemon are physical attackers. And now my Greedent gets a free Swords Dance, which will bring it up to +2 attack, while my Stakataka sets up the Trick Room. It's important to note that Greedent cannot pick up the KO onto Dynamax Reshiram with Max Quake at +2 attack. It needs to be at +4 attack in order for Max Quake to pick up the KO. And that's if the Reshiram doesn't have any HP investment. But this Reshiram doesn't seem like it has any HP investment since it has the Life Orb item, which means that it is most likely a max special attack and a max speed Reshiram. And now it is time once again to Dynamax the Greedent. Once again, I'm going to have my Stakataka use Body Press onto my Greedent to prop my Greedent's Weakness Policy, which will bring my Greedent up to +4 attack, and then my Greedent should be able to pick up the KO onto the Dynamax Reshiram with a Max Quake at +4 attack. And it is indeed a one-hit KO. Who needs Reshiram when you can beat legendary Pokemon with a Squirrel? My opponent lost their Dynamax Pokemon and their restricted Pokemon, and I've still got my Greedent at +4 attack, so this game is pretty much over at this point. The Whimsicott is going to finish off my Stakataka with a Moonblast, but that will allow my Torkoal to come in for free. And now that the Reshiram is gone, my opponent has nothing else that resists Fire-type moves, so my Torkoal can just clean up with some Choice Specs and Sun-boosted Eruptions. And of course I still have my Dynamax Greedent, which is at +4 attack, so it's pretty much GG at this point. My opponent is going to send in the Landorus Incarnate, but there's nothing that my opponent can do to stop my Greedent and Torkoal from sweeping the rest of their team. The Whimsicott is going to use Charm on my Greedent, but it's too late for that. They should have won for the Charm play last turn, and then the Dynamax Reshiram would have survived the Max Quake from my Greedent. But I'm pretty sure my opponent wasn't expecting my Greedent to have the Weakness Policy item. I'm going to double into the Landorus Incarnate since the Whimsicott isn't really a threat. The Landorus survived the Eruption from my Torkoal, so the Landorus most likely has the Assault Vest item, but my Greedent is going to finish it off with a Max Strike. Even if Whimsicott brings my Greedent's attack really low using Charm, I still have Torkoal, which is getting massive damage with those Eruptions. So as long as you're able to set up the Trick Room and keep constant pressure on your opponent, it's very difficult for your opponent to make a comeback. I should also mention that the speed draws for Max Strike are not ideal while Trick Room is in effect, but it shouldn't be that much of an issue since Greedent and Torkoal are very slow Pokemon. You should make sure to knock out any slow Pokemon like Amoonguss as soon as possible so that there won't be any issues with speed control under Trick Room. Anyways, my Torkoal is going to knock out the Whimsicott and the Tapu Koko with an Eruption, and that's going to be the end of the game. Alright, so we got another battle here, and my opponent is going to lead with Regieleki and Urshifu, while I'm going to lead with my Greedent and my Stakataka as usual. The Urshifu is threatening both my Greedent and my Stakataka with a super effective close combat. I'm not sure if my opponent knows that my Stakataka has a Focus Sash, but the Regieleki is going to go for the Volt Switch into my Stakataka, and my opponent is going to send in Porygon 2. Since the Regieleki went for the Volt Switch into my Stakataka, I thought maybe my opponent doubled into the Stakataka slot, so I thought the Urshifu was going for a close combat into my Stakataka, but the Urshifu actually goes for the Wicked Blow into my Greedent. So it seems that my opponent was predicting my Greedent to switch out into my Calyrex Shadow Rider, but anyways, my Greedent is going to set up with a Swords Dance, which will bring it up to +2 attack, and my Stakataka is going to set up the Trick Room. But now that there's a Porygon 2 on the field, I'm going to have to make a risky play. My opponent could protect the Urshifu and try to reverse the Trick Room with Porygon 2. I don't want my opponent to reverse the Trick Room, so I need to get this Porygon 2 off the field now. Even if the Urshifu knocks out my Greedent or my Stakataka, I should still be fine since I have Torkoal in the back. My opponent doesn't have any Pokemon on their team that can deal with Torkoal under Trick Room, so my win condition is to make sure that my opponent does not reverse the Trick Room and to constantly keep up the pressure on my opponent. So now my Greedent is going to knock out this Porygon 2 with the Max Strike at +4 attack. So at least I don't have to worry about Porygon 2 anymore. And again, the speed drops from Max Strike are not ideal under Trick Room, but it's not going to matter in this case since Urshifu is very fast compared to Greedent and Stakataka. The Urshifu is going to finish off my Stakataka with a close combat, so my Torkoal gets to come in for free. It's going to be very difficult for my opponent to deal with my Dynamax Greedent and Torkoal, since Urshifu and Regieleki don't do well under Trick Room. And my opponent's restricted Pokemon is Calyrex Ice Rider, but it's not a good option when I have my Torkoal on the field. My opponent is going to send in Regieleki, but there's not much my opponent can do with Urshifu and Regieleki under Trick Room. The Urshifu could try to pick up the KO onto my Greedent with a Sucker Punch, but my Greedent should be able to survive the Sucker Punch at the amount of HP it has left, and my Torkoal is the bigger threat since it can target both of the opposing Pokemon with Eruption, so there's not much my opponent can do. I'm going to have my Greedent target the Urshifu with a Max Strike, which will bring it down to its Focus Sash, and my Torkoal is going to get the double knockout with an Eruption, so at this point it's a 3v1 game. Now my opponent is going to send in their last Pokemon, which is the Calyrex Ice Rider. My opponent hasn't used their Dynamax yet, but my Greedent and my Torkoal should be able to knock out the Calyrex Ice Rider with the Max Darkness and Eruption, even if the Calyrex Ice Rider Dynamaxes. And my opponent doesn't even Dynamax Calyrex, so Max Darkness at +4 attack is going to pick up the KO, and that's going to be the end of the game. And here's the final battle of this video. My opponent is going to lead with Celesteela and Incineroar, while I'm going to lead with my Greedent and my Stakataka. The Incineroar could either go for the Fake Out onto my Stakataka, or it can taunt my Stakataka if it has the move Taunt. So I'm thinking the best play is to have my Stakataka go for the Body Press onto the Incineroar, but my opponent is going to make a really good play and switch out the Celesteela into Garchomp and go for the Fake Out onto my Stakataka. So this play breaks the Focus Sash on my Stakataka and prevents my Stakataka from doing anything this turn. And the Garchomp could Dynamax and go for the Max Quake into my Stakataka next turn to completely deny the Trick Room. I'm going to have my Greedent go for the Sword Stance, which will bring it up to +1 attack since the Intimidate dropped his attack by 1 stage. And now my opponent is going to Dynamax the Garchomp, so my Stakataka is definitely not going to be able to set up the Trick Room in this game, but I have a backup plan. Since I won't be able to set up the Trick Room, I'll need my Greedent to set up a couple more Sword Stances for the plan that I have in mind. The Dynamax Garchomp is going to knock out my Stakataka with a Max Quake as I expected, but my Calyrex Shadow Rider gets to come in for free next turn, so this is all a part of my plan. The Dynamax Garchomp and the Incineroar will get a special defense boost from the Max Quake, but that doesn't matter since my Greedent is a physical attacker, and I'll just keep on boosting its physical attack with Sword Stances until it has enough attack power to knock out this Dynamax Garchomp. If I can get my Greedent up to +4 attack, that should be enough to knock out this Dynamax Garchomp. The Incineroar went for a Parting Shot, so that brings my Greedent's attack back down to neutral. But but I'm going to have my Greedent go for another Swords Dance, which will bring it up to +2 attack. So I just need my Greedent to set up one more Swords Dance, and then we'll be good to go. My opponent is going to send in the Celesteela, which can be kind of annoying to deal with, but it's not really that big of a threat to my team, so I'll worry about it later on. Now I'm going to send in my Calyrex Shadow Rider. I need my Greedent to set up one more Swords Dance, so I'm going to have my Calyrex Shadow Rider go for the Protect, since I'm expecting the Garchomp to target my Calyrex with a Max Quake. And the Celesteela goes for the Wide Guard, since my opponent was expecting my Calyrex Shadow Rider to go for the Astral Barrage. My opponent is completely ignoring my Greedent, so they have no idea what's about to happen next turn. And the Dynamax Garchomp is going to target my Calyrex Shadow Rider with the Max Quake, as I expected, so everything is going according to plan so far. My opponent thinks that my Calyrex Shadow Rider is the bigger threat, but I've got a big surprise for my opponent. My Greedent is going to set up another Swords Dance, and my Greedent is finally at +4 attack. And now, it is time to Dynamax the Greedent. My Calyrex Shadow Rider has the move Speed Swap, and this move swaps the user's speed stat with the target Pokemon speed stat. So I'm going to have my Calyrex Shadow Rider target my Greedent with Speed Swap, which will swap its own speed stat with my Greedent's speed stat. And then my Greedent will become really fast, since it'll get my Calyrex Shadow Rider speed stat, which will allow my Greedent to move before the Garchomp even gets a chance to attack. My Greedent is at +4 attack, so that should be more than enough to knock out this Dynamax Garchomp. The Max Strike is going to pick up the KO onto the Dynamax Garchomp, and now I should be able to easily sweep through the rest of my opponent's team, since my Greedent is faster than everything on my opponent's team, thanks to the Speed Swap. The Celesteela is going to try to Leech Seed my Greedent, but the Greedent is going to avoid the Leech Seed. That doesn't really matter though, since my Greedent can just knock out the other Pokemon first and deal with the Celesteela later on. My opponent is going to send in the Incineroar, and the Intimidate will bring my Greedent down to +3 attack, but that's more than enough attack power to knock out this Incineroar. I'm going to preserve my Calyrex Shadow Rider and switch it out, and I'm going to send in my Torkoal. The Celesteela seems to be a more defensive Celesteela, so it shouldn't be able to do much damage to my Torkoal, so this should be a pretty safe switch for me. And my Dynamax Greedent is going to pick up the KO onto the Incineroar with a Max Strike at +3 attack. So my opponent is not really able to get much damage onto my Pokemon at this point. The Celesteela is going to go for the Flash Cannon into the Calyrex slot, but it's not going to do much damage to my Torkoal, which just switched in. So I've got one more turn of Dynamax, and my opponent is going to send in the Xerneas, but my Greedent should be able to pick up the KO onto the Xerneas with the Max Strike at +3 attack, and my opponent is going to forfeit the battle since my Greedent is just too much for them to deal with. Here's the Pokepaste for my team. I also put the link to the Pokepaste in the description for this video. Now I'm going to give you guys a full team summary and analysis of this team. With this team, you'll want to have Stakataka set up the Trick Room most of the time, since Greedent, Stakataka, and Torkoal are very slow Pokemon, so they function best under Trick Room. But this team is quite flexible, as you're not always required to set up Trick Room in order to win the game. Calyrex Shadow Rider has the move Speed Swap, which you can use to swap its speed stat with one of your slower Pokemon speed stat, such as Greedent, Stakataka, or Torkoal. Calyrex Shadow Rider is a very fast Pokemon, so the Speed Swap will make those Pokemon really fast, and they'll become more difficult to knock out since they're already very bulky Pokemon. The Torkoal and Venusaur mode of this team can help you deal with the Amoonguss matchup, as well as Pokemon that are faster than Calyrex. Torkoal's Drought ability will set up the Sun, and Venusaur's Chlorophyll ability doubles its speed when the Sun weather is in effect, which will allow this Venusaur to outspeed Regieleki, and Regieleki is the fastest Pokemon in the game. So basically, this team has 3 different options for speed control: Trick Room, Speed Swap, and the Torkoal and Venusaur mode. Now I'm going to talk about leads and the strategies for each lead. The first lead that I'm going to talk about is the Greedent and Stakataka lead. When leading with Greedent and Stakataka, you should have Torkoal and Calyrex Shadow Rider in the back. On the first turn of the battle, you can have Greedent set up a Swords Dance while Stakataka sets up the Trick Room. Stakataka has the Focus Sash item, so this will force your opponent to double into Stakataka to stop it from setting up the Trick Room. However, if your opponent chooses to double into Stakataka, and if Stakataka gets knocked out, Greedent will get a free Swords Dance, and on the next turn you can send in Calyrex Shadow Rider, Dynamax Greedent, and have Calyrex Shadow Rider use Speed Swap on Greedent, so that Greedent will get Calyrex's speed stat. And then you'll have a really fast Dynamax Greedent with +2 attack that can deal big damage with +2 max strikes. However, if your opponent chooses to split their attacks, they won't be able to pick out the KO onto Stakataka since it has the Focus Sash item. And if your opponent tries to use spread moves such as Earthquake and Water Spout, Stakataka can use Wide Guard to block those moves, while Greedent gets a free Swords Dance. If Stakataka is able to set up the Trick Room, you can have Stakataka use Body Press onto Greedent, which will prop Greedent's Weakness Policy, giving Greedent a +2 boost to its attack. So if Greedent was able to set up Swords Dance the previous turn, the Weakness Policy boost would bring Greedent up to +4 attack, and that's usually enough attack power to knock out most Pokemon. If Greedent gets knocked out on the first turn and Stakataka is able to set up the Trick Room, you can send in Torkoal on the next turn, and this Torkoal is very dangerous under Trick Room. My Torkoal is a Choice Specs Torkoal, so it's going to deal massive damage with Choice Specs and Sun boosted eruptions, and Stakataka can deal a lot of damage with Gyro Ball and Body Press as well. When the Trick Room ends, Calyrex Shadow Rider is a great option for a late game sweeper, and it can deal lots of damage with Astral Barrage and Expanding Force. Or it can use Speed Swap on Greedent, Stakataka, or Torkoal so that Greedent, Stakataka, or Torkoal will get Calyrex's speed stat, allowing them to outspeed the opposing Pokemon if the opposing Pokemon are slower than Calyrex. Most of your opponents will expect you to set up the Trick Room when they see Stakataka on the field, so one thing you should look out for is the move Imprison. If you suspect that one of your opponent's Pokemon has the move Imprison, you should double into that Pokemon and try to knock it out. And on the next turn, you can set up the Trick Room after you get rid of the imprisoned Pokemon. The next lead that I'm going to talk about is the Stakataka and Indeedee lead. If you decide to lead with Stakataka and Indeedee, you'll want to have Greedent and Torkoal in the back, since this is more of a hard Trick Room mode. In most situations, the Stakataka and Indeedee lead should allow you to safely set up the Trick Room. Indeedee's ability gives you Psychic Terrain support, which blocks Fake Out. Indeedee can redirect a potential taunt and single target attacks with Follow Me, while Stakataka can set up the Trick Room. If you know that your opponent is going to have both of their Pokemon use spread moves, you can have Stakataka use Wide Guard to block those spread moves. For example, if your opponent decides to lead with Landorus, Therian, and Galarian Moltres, and tries to use Earthquake and Fiery Wrath to knock out Stakataka and Indeedee, you could have Stakataka use Wide Guard, while Indeedee gets some damage onto Landorus with Expanding Force, or Dazzling Gleam to hit both Galarian Moltres and Landorus. On the following turn, you could have Indeedee use Follow Me, and have Stakataka set up the Trick Room, since your opponent is not likely to make the same play twice, since you revealed Wide Guard on the previous turn. It's usually safe to go for the Follow Me and Trick Room play in most situations, since Stakataka has a Focus Sash, so it's highly unlikely that your opponent will be able to knock out Stakataka unless they use two spread moves, or if the first move is a spread move that knocks out Indeedee, and if the second attack is able to knock out Stakataka. The next lead that I'm going to talk about is the Greedent and Indeedee lead. When leading with Greedent and Indeedee, I usually like to have my Calyrex Shadow Rider and my Torkoal in the back. Indeedee can redirect single target moves with Follow Me, while Greedent uses Swords Dance to increase his attack by 2 stages. You can repeat this play to try and get Greedent up to +4 or even +6 attack if your opponent is having trouble knocking out Indeedee. Once Indeedee faints, you should send in Calyrex Shadow Rider, Dynamax Greedent, and have Calyrex use Speed Swap onto Greedent so that Greedent will get Calyrex's speed stat, and you can try and get a Greedent sweep going. Another option is to have Calyrex Shadow Rider use Speed Swap on Torkoal, and then you'll have a really fast Torkoal that will get massive damage with Choice Specs and Sun boosted eruptions or Heat Waves. However, you should never lead with Greedent and Indeedee if your opponent has a lot of spread moves on their Pokemon, since Indeedee can only redirect single target moves. But if your opponent has mostly single target moves, then you should be fine. Also, watch out for Regieleki, since Regieleki can counter this strategy by using Electro Web. There are 2 leads that you can use to deal with Regieleki. The first lead would be Stakataka and Calyrex Shadow Rider, where you can have Stakataka use Wide Guard to block Electro Web, and Calyrex can pick up the KO onto Regieleki with Astral Barrage. The second lead would be Torkoal and Venusaur, where Venusaur in the Sun will outspeed Regieleki and can knock it out with the Life Orb boosted Earth Power. I already spoke about the Torkoal and Venusaur lead, so let's move on to the final lead that I want to talk about, which is the Calyrex Shadow Rider and Indeedee lead. Calyrex Shadow Rider and Indeedee have very good synergy. Indeedee's ability Psychic Surge provides Psychic Terrain support for Calyrex, which protects it from Sucker Punches and other priority moves. With the Psychic Terrain active, Expanding Force becomes a spread move, so Calyrex can get big damage onto the opposing Pokemon with Expanding Force. Indeedee can further boost the power of Expanding Force by using Helping Hand, and of course Indeedee itself can use Expanding Force. So this is basically a Psy-Spam lead. However, Dark-type Pokemon easily counter this lead, so if your opponent has any Dark-type Pokemon on their team, you should never lead with Calyrex Shadow Rider and Indeedee. Now I'm going to talk about each individual Pokemon as well as their held items, EV spreads, and moves. First, let's talk about Greedent. Greedent is the star of the show, and the goal is to proc Greedent's weakness policy and sweep your opponent's team with Greedent. Greedent is a normal type Pokemon, so it'll need to take super effective damage from a fighting type attack in order for the weakness policy to get procced. Greedent is a very slow Pokemon, so you want to make sure that you set up the Trick Room since Greedent functions best under Trick Room. Also, it's optimal to set up the Trick Room before having Stakataka proc Greedent's weakness policy with Body Press, since Stakataka is slower than Greedent. So under Trick Room, Stakataka will be moving before Greedent. The EV spread is very simple. 252 EVs in HP gives Greedent the maximum bulk so that it can take more hits. 252 EVs in attack with Brave Nature allows Greedent to have the maximum damage output with its physical attacks. And the remaining 4 EVs go in defense to give it 1 point in defense. Brave Nature with 0 IVs in speed makes Greedent as slow as possible, which is optimal for when you set up the Trick Room. As for Greedent's moves, Sword Stance allows Greedent to boost its attack by 2 stages. If Greedent is able to set up a Sword Stance and Stakataka is able to set up the Trick Room, Stakataka can use Body Press onto Greedent to proc Greedent's weakness policy on the next turn. And then Greedent will be at +4 attack and can start dealing massive damage to the opposing Pokemon. Sword Stance is also a useful option if you are unable to proc the weakness policy. As I mentioned earlier, Indeedee can provide redirection support for Greedent, allowing Greedent to safely set up at least 1 Sword Stance. Giga Impact allows Greedent to have a 150 base power max strike when you Dynamax Greedent, and this is the strongest possible base power for max strike. Just be careful when using max strike under Trick Room while slow Pokemon like Amoonguss are on the field, since the speed drop from max strike will allow a min-speed Amoonguss to move before Greedent on the next turn. Crunch gives Greedent coverage against Ghost-type Pokemon. Also, Max Darkness lowers the opposing Pokemon's special defense, which allows Torkoal to get more damage onto the opposing Pokemon with Eruption. Earthquake gives Greedent coverage against Rock and Steel-type Pokemon. Earthquake is also useful when dealing with Pokemon that have redirection moves such as Follow Me and Rage Powder. Stakataka has Wide Guard, so if you need to use Earthquake, just have Stakataka use Wide Guard. Also, Max Quake is useful in boosting Greedent's special defense. Now let's talk about Stakataka. Stakataka is the only Pokemon that is slower than Greedent that has access to Trick Room and a fighting type attack, so this makes Stakataka the most optimal Trick Room setter for this weakness policy strategy. The Focus Sash allows Stakataka to survive at least 1 attack, so the opposing Pokemon would need to hit Stakataka with at least 2 attacks in order to knock out Stakataka. This Stakataka's highest stat is defense, so Stakataka's Beast Boost ability will increase its defense by 1 stage every time it knocks out a Pokemon, which is amazing in combination with the move Body Press, since the move Body Press will increase its damage output as Stakataka's defense increases. As for the EV spread, the 252 EVs in HP and 196 EVs in special defense allow Stakataka to survive +2 max Starfall from Dynamax Xerneas. This can be useful in situations where Stakataka had previously taken some chip damage. This Stakataka basically has a lot of special bulk, allowing it to stick around longer. The 60 EVs in attack with Brave Nature increase the damage output from Gyro Ball. Other than that, Stakataka already has a high defense stat, and Stakataka's ability Beast Boost will increase its defense stat every time it knocks out a Pokemon, so it has no need for any investment in its physical defense. Also, it's not ideal to put any investment in Stakataka's physical defense for this strategy, since Stakataka will be using Body Press to prop Greedent's weakness policy, and the damage that Greedent would take from Body Press depends on how high Stakataka's defense stat is. Brave Nature with 0 IVs in speed makes Stakataka as slow as possible, which is optimal for when you set up the Trick Room. As for Stakataka's moves, Trick Room is a very important move for this team since Greedent, Stakataka, and Torkoal function best under Trick Room. Trick Room reverses the order in which Pokemon attack for 5 turns, so slower Pokemon would move before faster Pokemon under Trick Room. Body Press is the fighting type move that Stakataka will use to proc Greedent's weakness policy. You should always make sure to Dynamax Greedent when proccing Greedent's weakness policy with Body Press from Stakataka, since Greedent would take a lot of damage from Body Press if you don't Dynamax Greedent. Dynamax Greedent takes about 31% damage from Body Press from the Stakataka. However, Body Press is the most optimal move for Stakataka, since the damage output from Body Press depends on Stakataka's defense stat. When Stakataka's Beast Boost ability increases its defense stat, the damage output from Body Press will increase, so Stakataka is one of the best Pokemon to use Body Press. You can even Dynamax Stakataka and use Max Steel Spike to boost Stakataka's defense, which will also increase the damage output from Body Press. Also, Body Press becomes Max Knuckle when you Dynamax Stakataka, which increases Stakataka's attack by 1 stage each time it is used, which will further increase the damage output from Max Knuckle, Max Steel Spike, and Gyro Ball. Gyro Ball is a great move for Stakataka. The damage output from Gyro Ball is higher the slower the user is, and Stakataka is a very slow Pokemon, so most of the time Stakataka will get the maximum damage output from Gyro Ball due to its incredibly slow speed. When you Dynamax Stakataka, Gyro Ball will become Max Steel Spike, which increases Stakataka's defense by 1 stage each time it is used. And again, Max Steel Spike and Body Press are a great combination of moves. Wide Guard allows Stakataka to protect itself and its ally Pokemon from spread moves like Water Spout and Earthquake. You can sometimes force your opponent to Dynamax early in order to play around Wide Guard, but in the late game where your opponent has already used up their Dynamax, Wide Guard could potentially win you the game if your opponent's best attacking option is a spread move. Now let's talk about Indeedee. As I mentioned before, Indeedee's ability Psychic Surge provides Psychic Terrain support, which blocks priority moves such as Fake Out and Sucker Punch, as well as Prankster priority moves. Psychic Seed is a great item for Indeedee since it automatically activates when the Psychic Terrain is activated, so basically it'll activate as soon as you send out Indeedee, giving Indeedee a +1 boost to its special defense. The EV spread is very simple. Indeedee is already getting a +1 boost to its special defense from the Psychic Seed item, so the 252 EVs in HP and 252 EVs in defense, along with the relaxed nature, makes this a physically defensive Indeedee, and the remaining 4 EVs in special defense will give it 1 point in special defense. This EV spread along with the +1 boost in special defense from the Psychic Seed makes it difficult for the opposing Pokemon to knock out Indeedee, so that Indeedee can stick around longer to provide redirection support and helping hand support. The 0 IVs in attack are useful in reducing the damage taken from foul play as well as confusion damage. The 0 IVs in speed are useful when your opponent sends out a Rillaboom or Tapu Fini at the same time that you send out Indeedee. Female Indeedee, Rillaboom, and Tapu Fini all have the same base speed, and you'll want to make sure that your terrain is a terrain that remains on the field. The slowest Pokemon's ability will get activated last, so it's optimal that Indeedee is at min speed with relaxed nature to guarantee that Indeedee's terrain will activate last and will remain on the field. As for Indeedee's moves, Follow Me redirects all single target moves to Indeedee, which is useful in allowing Greedent to set up Swords Dances, or Stakataka can set up the Trick Room while taking little to no damage from the redirected attacks. Indeedee can use Helping Hand to boost the power of an ally Pokemon's attack by 50%. Expanding Force is the best Psychic type move for Indeedee to have since it has great synergy with the Psychic terrain. The move Expanding Force increases in power by 50% and damages all opposing Pokemon when the Psychic terrain is active. And Expanding Force gets an additional 30% boost, since Psychic type moves get a 30% boost from the Psychic terrain. And finally, Dazzling Gleam gives Indeedee coverage against Dark type Pokemon. Now let's talk about Calyrex Shadow Rider. Spell Tag gives Calyrex a 20% boost to its Ghost type attacks, so Astro Barrage will get a 20% boost. Calyrex Shadow Rider has an ability called As One, which is a combination of 2 abilities, Unnerve and Grimmsnarl. Unnerve is a useful ability which prevents the opposing Pokemon from using any berries while Calyrex is on the field, including the damage reducing berries such as Shuka Berry and Aka Berry. You can use this to your advantage as the Unnerve ability will make it easier to pick up KOs on Pokemon that depend on damage reducing berries to survive an attack. Grimmsnarl increases Calyrex Shadow's special attack each time it knocks out a Pokemon, which makes it easy for Calyrex Shadow Rider to quickly snowball through teams. The EV spread is a standard EV spread. Timid Nature with 252 EVs in special attack and 252 EVs in speed makes Calyrex as fast as possible while having strong special attack. The remaining 4 EVs give it 1 point in HP. Calyrex Shadow Rider needs to be at max speed since it's always important that the user of Speed Swap is at max speed. As for the IVs, Calyrex Shadow Rider in the rental code that I provided at the beginning of this video does not have 0 IVs in attack since I did not have time to software set for a Calyrex Shadow Rider with 0 IVs in attack in my Pokemon Sword game. However, it should have 0 IVs in attack since this is optimal in reducing the damage that it takes from foul play as well as confusion damage. Although foul play might pick up the KO onto Calyrex Shadow Rider anyways since it is 4 times weak to dark type moves. Anyways, that's why you see that I wrote that Calyrex Shadow Rider has 0 IVs in attack in the Pokepace. As for Calyrex Shadow Rider's moves, Protect is a pretty standard move in double battles that allows you to play more defensively with Calyrex, so it'll stick around longer. Expanding Force is a great move for Calyrex Shadow Rider, and in combination with Indeedee's Psychic terrain, Expanding Force will deal big damage to the opposing Pokemon. Astro Barrage is a very strong Ghost type spread move, and it will get a 20% boost from Calyrex's Spell Tag item. Finally, Speed Swap is my favorite move on Calyrex Shadow Rider. Calyrex can use the move Speed Swap to swap its speed stat with the speed stat of one of its ally Pokemon to make that ally Pokemon really fast. Basically, when Calyrex uses the move Speed Swap with another Pokemon, that Pokemon would get Calyrex's speed stat, and Calyrex would get that Pokemon's speed stat. So if Calyrex Shadow Rider uses Speed Swap on Greedent, Greedent will get Calyrex's speed stat, and Calyrex would get Greedent's speed stat. So Calyrex would now be a very slow Pokemon. But you could switch out Calyrex Shadow Rider to reset its speed stat. Now let's talk about Torkoal. Choice Specs increases Torkoal's special attack by 50%, which along with the 50% boost to fire type attacks from the sun, allows Torkoal to deal massive damage onto both opposing Pokemon with Eruption. It's a very powerful combination, and Torkoal functions best under Trick Room, since it is a very slow Pokemon, so it's always best to have Stakataka set up the Trick Room for Torkoal. The Drought ability sets up the Sun for Torkoal, which increases the power of fire-type moves such as Eruption and Heat Wave, and also allows Torkoal to use Solar Beam immediately without needing to spend a turn to charge up. As for the EV spread, 252 EVs in HP give Torkoal the bulk that it needs to stick around longer. The 252 EVs in special attack along with the quiet nature maximize the damage output of Torkoal's special attacks. And the last 4 EVs go in defense to give Torkoal 1 point in defense. As for the IVs, again 0 IVs in attack minimize the damage taken from foul play as well as confusion damage. 0 IVs in speed with the quiet nature make Torkoal as slow as possible, which is optimal under Trick Room. As for Torkoal's moves, Eruption is Torkoal's strongest option for a fire-type spread move, but it depends on Torkoal's current HP. The higher Torkoal's current HP is, the more damage Eruption will do to the opposing Pokemon. The lower Torkoal's HP is, the less damage Eruption will do to the opposing Pokemon. When Torkoal's HP gets low, it's necessary to have another fire-type move for Torkoal to use. Heat Wave is another strong option for a fire-type spread move. Solar Beam gives Torkoal coverage against water, rock, and ground-type Pokemon, which Torkoal is weak to. And finally, Earth Power allows Torkoal to get super effective damage onto fire-type Pokemon which resist Eruption, Heat Wave, and Solar Beam. And finally, let's talk about Venusaur. Venusaur being a Grass-type Pokemon is not affected by Rage Powder, so it's a great answer to Amoonguss. This Venusaur is a Gigantamax Venusaur, which allows it to use G-Max Vine Lash when you Gigantamax Venusaur. In addition to the damage dealt by G-Max Vine Lash, G-Max Vine Lash also deals residual damage to all opposing Pokemon that are not Grass-type Pokemon at the end of each turn for 4 turns. The Life Orb item gives Venusaur a 30% boost to its attacks. Venusaur's Chlorophyll ability doubles its speed when the sun weather is in effect, allowing Venusaur to outspeed Pokemon that would normally outspeed it, such as Cinderace and Regieleki. As for the EV spread, it's a simple EV spread that maximizes Venusaur's speed and special attack with the 4 remaining EVs going to HP. Venusaur must have Timid Nature in order to outspeed max speed Regieleki when the sun weather is in effect. 0 IVs in attack with Timid Nature minimizes the damage that Venusaur takes from foul play, and it also minimizes confusion damage. As for Venusaur's moves, Sleep Powder is great for putting Pokemon to sleep that threaten it. Venusaur in the sun will outspeed every Pokemon in the metagame, so it's definitely advantageous having a Pokemon that can move before the opposing Pokemon and put something to sleep before the opposing Pokemon get a chance to attack. Frenzy Plant allows G-Max Vine Lash to get 150 base power, which is the maximum base power for G-Max Vine Lash. Sludge Bomb allows Venusaur to get super effective damage on Grass and Fairy type Pokemon. Sludge Bomb becomes Max Ooze when you Gigantamax Venusaur, which has great synergy with Venusaur since Max Ooze increases Venusaur's special attack each time it is used. And finally, Earth Power gives Venusaur coverage against Fire, Poison, and Steel type Pokemon. As you can see in this battle, I'm completely ignoring the Amoonguss, since Amoonguss can't really do much damage to Venusaur anyways, so the idea is to target the other Pokemon first, and deal with Amoonguss after knocking out the other Pokemon first. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed watching this video, make sure to hit that like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you all next time.